Imagine yourself as a respected Roman senator, a man whose family name echoes through generations, rooted deeply in the very fabric of the empire. Your toga bears the purple stripe, a symbol of your noble status. For decades, you have dedicated your life to serving Rome with honor and loyalty. Tonight, you hold in your hands a golden invitation, an exclusive summons to dine with the emperor himself. Such an honor should inspire pride and excitement. Yet, as you ascend the gleaming marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, and not Titans, in your stomach, the guards standing at the entrance avoid your gaze. Their silence is heavy, filled with unspoken warnings. They know what lies ahead. The rich scent of incense drifts through the air, attempting to mask a darker presence, something more sinister. It is a fear that clings to the atmosphere, thick and suffocating. You push open the grand doors to the great hall. Inside, the empire's elite have gathered. Senators, their wives, wealthy merchants, military commanders. Yet, despite the crowd, an uncomfortable silence hangs between them like a shadow. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps breaks the stillness, echoing through the marble corridors. The chilling laughter that follows sends a cold shiver down your spine. Laughter that seems manic, unhinged. Emperor Caligula appears, dressed in shimmering silk that gleams like molten gold. His eyes blaze with a wild intensity, scanning the room as a predator would a prey. Then, with theatrical flair, he claps his hands and proclaims to all present, "My dear friends, tonight we shall uncover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see how far you will go to prove your loyalty. What unfolds next will shatter every notion of Roman dignity. The sacred halls of power will become a twisted stage for Caligula's darkest desires. This is the story of madness, of how one man's descent into corruption poisoned an entire empire, and how absolute power became absolute ruin taught to understand. This terrifying chapter, we must first explore the path that led Caligula to the throne. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, he earned the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, during his childhood. He had accompanied his father, Germanicus, on military campaigns, dressed in miniature soldier's gear, charming the legions with his innocent appearance. But for a child of the imperial family, innocence was a fragile illusion. By the age of 7, Caligula had witnessed horrors no child should endure. His father died under mysterious circumstances, likely poisoned on the orders of Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina, the elder, and his brothers were banished, imprisoned, and killed, victims of the ruthless and paranoid imperial politics. Imagine the terror of living every day knowing that a knock at your door might mean your end. Caligula grew up in a world where weakness meant death and trust was a luxury no one could afford. He learned to survive by mastering deception, presenting a harmless facade, while his family was torn apart. These early traumas left a deep mark on him. They shaped his later obsession with control, his compulsive need to dominate and humiliate those who reminded him of the forces that had destroyed his youth. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed the 24-year-old Caligula as their new emperor with genuine hope. He was the beloved son of Germanicus, the boy who had once won the loyalty of the armies. After decades, under the shadow of the paranoid and reclusive Tiberius, Romans yearned for a fresh starter, return to past glory. For 7 months, Caligula seemed to be that new dawn. He recalled political exiles, rewarded the Praetorian Guard generously, and hosted spectacular public games. The people adored him. But then something changed. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell gravely ill with what ancient texts call a brain fever. His sickness was so severe it brought the empire to a halt. For days, he teetered on the edge between life and death. Rome held its breath, praying for his survival. Some historians believe this illness caused permanent brain damage. Others say it stripped away the fragile layer of sanity that had kept his darker urges in check. When Caligula finally recovered, those closest to him sensed an alarming transformation. The young man who had once displayed restraint and political wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone untethered from reality, a ruler, with no respect for boundaries between sacred and profane. Acceptable and taboo at first, the change was subtle. There were signs in small, disturbing details: extravagant spending, strange behavior in private councils, erratic rulings. But behind the palace walls, something far darker was unfolding. Caligula had discovered a terrifying truth. As emperor, he wielded unchecked power. He could do anything to anyone and no one could stop him. The first victims of this twisted reign were the palace servants, those who had faithfully served the imperial family for years. Suddenly found themselves at the mercy of the emperor's bizarre whims and cruel sexual demands. Young male slaves were especially vulnerable, summoned to the emperor's private chambers to endure acts that violated every shred of Roman dignity. Yet it was the female servants who bore the brunt of this nightmare. Ancient sources, cautious in their wording, reveal how Caligula prowled the palace corridors at night, seizing women at random to satisfy his lust. These encounters were far from consensual. They were exercises in dominance designed to remind everyone that his power was absolute, unstoppable. Caligula's cruelty extended beyond servants. He began inviting the wives of senators and other powerful men to private meetings under the pretense of discussing family affairs or political careers. These women, raised under Rome's strict moral codes, found themselves trapped in horrifying situations. Rejecting the emperor's advances wasn't an option, it meant death. Not just for themselves, but for their entire families. One chilling account tells of Caligula forcing these women to strip naked and perform degrading acts while he watched from his throne, sometimes with several women competing for his favor. The psychological torment was as deliberate as the physical abuse. Once proud Roman matrons, respected throughout the empire, were reduced to playthings for the emperor's twisted amusement. What makes Caligula's transformation so horrifying is not only the abuse itself, but how methodically he used sex as a weapon to dismantle Roman society. By forcing the empire's most esteemed citizens to endure or witness acts of humiliation, he crushed their spirits far more effectively than any torture device. Caligula's infamous dinner parties became stages for this cruelty. These began as formal social events, where senators attended with their wives and daughters, maintaining a fragile illusion of civility. But as the nights wore on, the emperor's demands grew darker. He might call out to a senator with casual cruelty, "Senator Marcus, your wife has such beautiful eyes, I wonder how they look on her knees before me." The senator sat silent, terror gripping his heart. Any objection could mean death for his whole family. The women, powerless, had no choice but to obey often, while their husbands and children looked on in silent horror. These events tore families apart. Marriages shattered, children were scarred. Noble bloodlines degraded into tools of Caligula's perverse pleasure. The emperor reveled in forcing senators to witness these humiliations. Special seating was arranged so husbands could see their wives forced into sexual acts, whether with Caligula himself or his chosen partners. The men's faces twisted with rage, helplessness, and shame, feeding the emperor's dark satisfaction. The very palace itself changed under Caligula's command. On Palatine Hill, the imperial palace was remodeled to fit his growing sexual fantasies. New chambers were built, rooms designed for group encounters, outfitted with circular couches for full visibility like a theater stage. One room resembled a small amphitheater, with raised seats surrounding a central space where Caligula staged his performances. Captured enemies, slaves, and even Roman citizens were forced into degrading acts with senators and their families, watching and applauding. Caligula's bedroom became a place of terror. Unlike the private quarters of past emperors, his chamber had viewing balconies and multiple entrances, allowing him to bring audiences to watch his encounters. He seemed to take as much pleasure from being observed as from the acts themselves, turning sex into a public display of power. Within the palace walls, Caligula also set up what can only be called a brothel. Wives and daughters of disgraced senators were forced to serve not just the emperor, but his guests, foreign dignitaries, soldiers, anyone he chose. The emperor often personally supervised these sessions, directing them like a cruel theater director. Perhaps the darkest twist of all was how Caligula twisted religion and politics into instruments of sexual degradation. Sacred rituals, once performed with solemn reverence, became grotesque displays of humiliation. During Senate meetings, he sometimes ordered senators' wives to perform sexual acts while their husbands conducted official business. Governance itself became inseparable from abuse. Religious ceremonies were desecrated in the emperor's name. Claiming divine status, Caligula demanded that worship include public sexual acts performed in his honor. Priestesses, bound by vows of chastity, were forced to engage in intercourse as part of rituals. Festivals, once marked by solemnity, became excuses for orgies involving unwilling noble participants. His marriage ceremonies were no exception. What should have been sacred bonds became spectacles of degradation in the emperor's cruel game to humiliate Rome's elite and remind everyone of his absolute rule. Caligula's marriages and divorces were a grotesque spectacle, sometimes happening within days. Each wedding served as a calculated act of humiliation, forcing brides' families to witness the consummation as a public display of power. Marriage, a sacred institution, became nothing more than a performance of conquest. But his sexual appetites went beyond personal gratification. They were weapons of economic terror. Targeting Rome's elite, he demanded access to their wives and daughters in exchange for safety or political favor. Refusal meant ruin. Invitations to private audiences were thinly veiled threats, leaving families powerless. He institutionalized the abuse, creating a twisted taxation system where wealthy households contributed women for palace service. Duration and frequency depended on their wealth. This wasn't prostitution, it was state-enforced sexual slavery, a brutal reminder of the emperor's absolute control. Resistance brought unimaginable consequences. Women who refused faced public degradation at gladiatorial games or were sold into prostitution, their nobility stripped away. The message was clear: no one, no matter how born, was beyond Caligula's reach. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Raised to value virtue above all, these women endured violations that shattered their identities. Many attempted suicide, but even death wasn't an escape. Families of those who took their own lives faced collective execution or financial annihilation. Men, too, were ensnared in the horror. Fathers delivered daughters to the emperor's chambers. Husbands prepared their wives for abuse. By forcing their complicity, Caligula destroyed their honor, ensuring their loyalty through shame. Children weren't spared. Forced to witness or participate in sexual acts, they carried lifelong scars. Some became future abusers, perpetuating the cycle. Caligula knew, traumatized the elite's children, and his corruption would outlast his reign. In his final years, he framed the abuse as divine ritual. Temples hosted mandatory sexual worship, twisting religion to justify atrocities. Provincial officials mimicked his cruelty, spreading the terror empire-wide. Caligula's reign wasn't just tyranny, it was a systematic dismantling of humanity through sex, power, and fear. Caligula's marriages were never about love, they were spectacles of domination. Historical accounts describe ceremonies where brides were selected not for political alliance, but for the emperor's amusement. He would marry noble women only to divorce them days later, turning matrimony into a cruel joke. But the true horror lay in the wedding nights. Caligula didn't just consummate these marriages in private, he turned them into public displays. Fathers, brothers, and even senators were forced to watch as he violated their daughters, sisters, and wives. The message was unmistakable. No. Family, no matter how powerful, was beyond his reach. Some records suggest he even staged mock ceremonies, marrying women only to discard them hours later. The brides, stripped of dignity, returned home to families now branded as powerless. These weren't just personal humiliations, they were political statements, reinforcing that in Caligula's Rome, no tradition was sacred. Caligula's exploitation went beyond individual cruelty, was systemic. He weaponized desire, targeting the wives and daughters of Rome's wealthiest families. A summons to the palace wasn't an invitation, it was an ultimatum. Refusal meant exile, confiscated wealth, or worse, execution. The emperor's demands created a perverse marketplace. Fathers negotiated their daughters' service in exchange for tax relief or political protection. Some families, desperate to survive, began offering their women preemptively, hoping to buy favor before Caligula's eye fell upon them. This wasn't mere debauchery, it was financial strategy. By forcing the elite into sexual debt, Caligula ensured their obedience. A senator whose daughter shared the emperor's bed couldn't oppose him in court. A merchant whose wife was a palace guest wouldn't dare withhold funds. The system fed itself, growing more insidious with each passing year. Inside the imperial residence, Caligula institutionalized his perversions. He established a rotation system where noblewomen served fixed terms as his companions. Duration depended on their family's wealth. The richer the house, the longer their obligation. These women weren't courtesans. They were hostages. Guards ensured compliance, while scribes recorded each transaction. Some families received official notices. Your daughter's service is required for 30 days. Failure to comply will result in penalties. Resistance was futile. Women who refused were paraded through the streets before being sold to brothels. Their families faced ruined estates, seized names erased from public records. Caligula made certain Rome understood. Morality was a luxury only he could afford. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Roman women were raised to value pudicitious sexual virtue above all. To have it stripped away wasn't just physical violation, it was spiritual annihilation. Some accounts describe noblewomen collapsing into madness after palace visits. Others drowned themselves in the Tiber rather than return. But Caligula anticipated this. Families of suicides were punished more harshly. A father who buried a daughter by her own hand might find himself crucified beside her corpse. The emperor took particular pleasure in breaking the defiant. One story tells of a senator's wife who spat in his face. Caligula had her stripped and whipped through the forum before gifting her to his gladiators. By nightfall, she was begging for death. The tragedy extended to Rome's men. Caligula didn't just victimize women, he forced their male relatives to participate. Fathers escorted daughters to his chambers. Husbands bathed and perfumed their wives for imperial visits. This wasn't passive compliance, it was active complicity. A senator who tied his own wife to Caligula's bed could never again command respect. His reputation wasn't just damaged, it was weaponized against him. Some tried to resist. A few refused to bring their women when summoned. Their fates were theatrical, burned alive in the circus, fed to beasts, or forced to watch as their entire lineage was erased. Caligula's cruelty knew no age limits. Noble children, some as young as 12, were brought to palace festivals, where they witnessed unspeakable acts. Many were forced to participate, their trauma ensuring lifelong silence. These weren't impulsive crimes. They were investments. A boy violated at 13 would grow into a broken man, easy to control. A girl abused before puberty would never risk defiance. Caligula wasn't just corrupting individuals, he was engineering a submissive ruling class. In his final years, Caligula declared himself a living god, and perversion became worship. Palace temples hosted sacred rites where sex with the emperor was communion. Senators knelt not to pray, but to watch as their wives performed devotions. This was more than madness, it was genius. By framing abuse as piety, Caligula silenced dissent. To refuse was blasphemy. To protest was heresy. Even Stoic philosophers, who prized moral courage, fell silent. When Caligula finally fell to the assassin's blade, Rome exhaled, but the damage endured. Generations of nobles bore invisible scars. Some survivors became tyrants themselves, replicating the abuse they'd endured. Others retreated into silence, their shame outliving the emperor. His reign proved a terrifying truth. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it perverts, dismantles, and recreates in its own image. The result was an empire where sexual abuse became a standard tool of governance. Local populations lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons might be selected for sexual service to imperial officials. This created a climate of terror that stretched far beyond the marble walls of the palace, reaching millions across the Roman world. Women everywhere learned to live with the horrifying knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that at any moment they could be claimed by representatives of the emperor for his cruel purposes. This systematic sexual terrorism became one of the defining horrors of Caligula's reign, leaving psychological scars that would ripple through Roman society for generations. By 40 CE, Caligula's excesses had reached new, shocking extremes. Palace gatherings devolved into elaborate, multi-day spectacles involving hundreds of participants forced into increasingly depraved acts. These orgies were not mere indulgences, but theatrical displays of absolute imperial power over human dignity and morality. In his final months, Caligula staged massive orgies that included senators and their families, foreign dignitaries, even animals, creating grotesque Toblo designed to assert his dominion over all aspects of life. These performances transcended personal gratification. They were philosophical statements, by compelling Rome's most respected citizens to degrade themselves and their families. Caligula declared the traditional Roman virtues of honor and dignity meaningless under the shadow of absolute authority. The breaking point came when Caligula announced plans to formalize his sexual abuses as the empire's official religion requiring every Roman citizen to participate in sexual rituals as demonstrations of loyalty. This threat to impose his reign of terror universally galvanized his enemies. On January 24, 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula in the underground passages of his own palace. But even in death, the emperor's legacy of sexual crimes haunted the empire. Many of his assassins were driven not just by political motives, but by personal vengeance. Having been forced to witness or suffer the abuse of their own family members, the new emperor, Claudius, faced the daunting task of addressing the aftermath. The evidence of Caligula's depravity was everywhere. Rooms outfitted for sexual torture, vast collections of pornographic art depicting real palace victims, detailed records of illicit encounters used to blackmail Rome's elite. Much of this was quietly destroyed, not to preserve Caligula's memory, but to shield victims and their families from further humiliation. Abusive chambers were sealed or completely remodeled, as if to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. Historical accounts, too, were carefully coded. Ancient writers documented Caligula's crimes but shrouded them in euphemism, respecting the survivor's desire for discretion. This conspiracy of silence was one of the most tragic outcomes of the sexual terror. Victims could rarely speak openly without risking their honor and standing. Women who survived the abuse lived in a society that blamed them, regardless of circumstance. Men who had helplessly witnessed their family's degradation were trapped by their own shame and complicity. Children bore trauma in silence for decades. Because of this silence, the full extent of Caligula's abuses may never be known. Families devastated by sexual terror had every reason to bury their suffering, and historical records reflect only the barest outlines of the horror. The imperial administration prioritized political stability over justice, leaving survivors to cope without support or recognition. The impact of Caligula's sexual reign extended far beyond his brief 4-year rule. Psychological trauma among Rome's elite created generational patterns of dysfunction. Many children raised amid palace terror grew into adults incapable of healthy relationships, some perpetuating cycles of abuse, others becoming lifelong victims. Marriages destroyed by forced sexual encounters rarely recovered. Families that survived were permanently marked. The social fabric of Roman aristocracy weakened and frayed. Perhaps most ominously, Caligula's sexual terrorism established a pattern repeated by future emperors. While later rulers might not have matched his extremes, they understood the power of sexual exploitation as a tool to maintain control and eliminate opposition. Today, tourists wander the ruins of Palatine Hill, admiring remnants of imperial grandeur, without fully grasping the horrors that unfolded within these crumbling walls. Beneath the surface, evidence remains. Foundation stones of rooms designed for torture, drainage channels built to wash away the physical traces of abuse, and underground passages where terrified victims awaited their summons. The ghosts of Caligula's victims still linger haunting the marble halls where a senator's wife took her own life to escape imperial attention, where a child witnessed unspeakable acts, where a proud matron was broken and forced into the palace brothel. Their stories were deliberately erased from history, but their suffering is etched into the stones themselves. Caligula's transformation of the imperial palace into a theatre of sexual horror lasted less than 4 years, but its echoes shaped Roman history and resonate to this day. His crimes remind us that sexual abuse is not just ancient barbarism. It is a recurring weapon wielded by those with unchecked power. The palatial ruins may stand silent, but the lessons endure. Sexual violence by those in authority is a pattern as old as civilization itself. Only the players and scales change. The emperor who turned his palace into an orgy left behind a legacy far darker than any monumental legacy carved into the shattered souls of victims, a grim warning that the worst crimes destroy not just bodies, but the very spirit of a people.